Hi guys, so this lecture is on the introduction for part of our writing guide. So with an introduction, it seems like they're easy to do, and they actually are once you kind of learn the process and you kind of learn the pattern they have to go through. But they can also be very hard because they're the first thing you write, and especially if you're kind of dealing with writer's block, they can be very hard to start them. But really, an introduction at its best, when it's really done well, what an introduction does, it's a roadmap. It's a way of not just laying out your argument, but it's a way to lay out kind of everything you want to do, everything you're going to do, so that your reader never gets lost. They always understand where you're going, what you're trying to do, what you're trying to say. Also, it's a way for you to lay that out for yourself. If you really write a good introduction, you have a good idea of where you're going. You have a way to you have a map for yourself so you don't get lost. And that happens very often, especially in first drafts. We write, we type a bunch of stuff, and then we kind of forget what were we trying to do. Your introduction very clearly says, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to do it, this is what you need to know. So, the first thing that introduction must do, it must introduce the overall argument topic or issue, meaning it really needs to bring out what are you writing about? Why are you writing? What are you writing about? What world do you inhabit? Or if you're, again, in something like political science, you might be writing about a law, or you might be writing about a type of government. If you're in psychology, you might be writing about a specific neurological disorder, a specific social disorder, a specific case. If you're writing in cinema, if you're writing for a cinema TV paper, it might be on on looking at the difference between film and digital film, or looking at the difference between even writing for the screen in the sense of TV versus writing a screenplay for a movie. These are all things that general topics. And they are general. They're meant to be generals to kind of give your reader an idea of where you're going, what kind of general sandbox you're playing in. So, you want to make sure that you're defining terms. This is especially, again, don't assume reader knowledge. If you're writing using very specific terms, this is where you might want to define them, or at least give your reader an idea of what you're talking about, as if they don't know. Number two, you have to introduce and briefly summarize the primary sources. So primary sources are essentially, what evidence are you using? What is the primary thing you're studying, your paper is looking at to prove what you think is true? So if you're writing about World War Z, you would want to introduce, obviously, the title of the book, who wrote it, and briefly what it's about. And this is the key, briefly. You don't want to spend a page just saying, well, then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. That doesn't do anybody any good, and that certainly doesn't make your essay any better. What you want to focus on is, again, assume your readers never read it, but they have no interest in a book report. They have no interest in hearing you drone on. They simply want to hear, what is it briefly about, who's it by, what key information do I need to know? And that's really all you have to be doing. So you want to focus on, again, the kind of primary, you really want to focus on the primary source. So, and the difference here is a primary source is, again, a novel, a book, an article, something you're directly engaging with. A secondary source would be something like what somebody says about that primary source. So this is like scholarly articles. We'll get into that a little bit more, but in general, just know, again, if you're actually, what you're studying is your primary source. If you're getting articles that talk about what you're studying, those are secondary sources, and you can introduce those later in body paragraphs. In the introduction, you want to focus on your primary sources only. Finally, the last thing is it must provide a thesis statement. And I'll have a whole separate lecture just on thesis statements, but for right now, you need to remember that a thesis statement is your argument. It's your entire essay in one sentence. It's exactly what you are going to do. It's the elevator pitch of your essay. So it needs to be concise, it needs to be specific, and it needs to kind of be balancing a lot of things. The way to think about it is, it needs to be doing two things. It needs to say what you're arguing, and then it needs to say, why are you arguing that? So in math terms, it's x equals a plus b plus c is the simplest formula. But what that really means is, this is true because of these specific reasons. And your thesis needs to be in that kind of format. It needs to be one sentence, not two or three. And it needs to have both. It's not just, well, vampires are evil. Okay, cool. That's not really an argument, that's a statement, right? An argument is something is true because of these reasons, and the purpose of your essay is to actually analyze those reasons, right? That's what's really important, is the purpose of your essay is to analyze reasons, not just say what is true over and over again. So your thesis, it really should be very specific, and again, it needs to be built to your essay. One thing that I do is, if I isolate your thesis and I apply it to another student's paper, and it makes sense, like that, your thesis matches another student's paper, then it's a bad thesis. Because a thesis should be specific to you and your paper only. Meaning, you all might be writing about the same concept, but how you argue that concept is true is unique to you, and your thesis needs to reflect that. So again, if you ever get lost, the kind of general basic thesis is, this is true because of these reasons, and you just fill in. So it might be, you know, dogs are better than cats because they're smaller, they're more self-sufficient, and they are less expensive. Or it could be something much more complicated like, Nazi Germany lost World War II at the Battle of Stalingrad due to the massive expenditure of material, the stifling defeat of morale, of not being able to conquer the Soviets quickly, and the year-long delay that allowed the Soviet Union to fully revitalize its war machine. Right, like that's a much more complicated thesis, but again, they're all thesis statements, and that's something that, again, every introduction should have. So what I'm going to do is, if you look at the actual lecture itself, I have a introduction for you that is kind of highlighted, that is annotated, so you can see the 3 jobs happening and what a good introduction should kind of look like. And so this is a student's, from some time ago, but it is a student's paper that they wrote for me, and I've identified it. So the job number 1, outlining kind of just the argument, the topic, that's bolded. And that is, what is more tempting than the prospect of eternal beauty and eternal youth? Vampires are a common sight in media, and vampiric entities appear in different mythologies across the globe. But this does not suggest that vampires are real, but rather they are our society's obsession with youth. A vampire is a creature that is neither living nor dead, never ages, and requires the blood or life force of the living to sustain itself. So reading that, that's just giving the overall topic. What's the topic of this essay? Vampires. What do the vampires mean? What are they? And again, it takes the time to define. Then we get into job number 2, which is looking at the primary sources. This is what's underlined. So in Bram Stoker's classic novel Dracula, and in Anne Rice's The Vampire Lestat, we are presented with 2 different examples of vampires, yet each one demonstrates that obsession with eternal beauty. The eponymous character of Dracula begins the game as an aged and death-like figure, yet during his seduction of Mina Harker, we see him as a beautiful, charming man. Anne Rice's Lestat is another character that embraces this cult of youth, as this centuries-old vampire turns himself into a rock star, making him another example of American society's obsession with youth. So again, this is introducing the 2 primary novels that the student was going to work with, which is Dracula by Bram Stoker and The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. And what's important here is you know what books they're using, who wrote the books, and you even have a very kind of brief concept of what the books are about. Again, it's not a play-by-play, it's not a very, very clear summary of, now you could say, you pretend you've read it. It's just a clear, this is what they're kind of about, this is all you really need to know. And then finally, in italics is the thesis statement. As vampires are presented as young, sexual, and eternal creatures coupled with the popularity of vampires in mass media, it is clear that vampires capture and represent America's obsession with youth. So there's the thesis, there's that essay laid out bare. What is the overall argument? Vampires represent America's obsession with youth. Why is this true? Well, they're presented as young, they're presented as sexual, they're presented as eternal creatures, and they're very popular in mass media. This is why this is true. So we have the premises of the argument, and we have the argument itself. So in general, when writing introductions, make sure you're mindful and you know what you're doing. If you're writing a sentence down, you should know what job is it serving. If you write a sentence, you should know, is that my thesis statement? Is that outlining the topic? Is that outlining the primary source? If it's not doing either of those, you need to think about why it's there. So that's introductions in a nutshell, with a little bit more focus on them. And again, remember, they're maps. That's what they should be. That's how you should be using them. They're maps. You don't want to hide something. This is not an article online that tries to surprise you at the end and be like, haha, and this is what is true. You want your reader to know exactly what you think, why you think it in the very beginning, because an essay is not about surprising them with what is true. It's about showing them why it is true. And your introduction is the map for that. So that's our that covers introductions. We'll move on next and look at body paragraphs, which again make up the bulk of your essay, and we'll keep going this. If you have questions, please ask, and remember, read through the notes as well. Don't just listen to the lecture. Make sure you're engaging multiple learning modalities at once, which is a fancy way of saying make sure you're reading things more than once so it sticks in your mind. In any case, I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.